So I've talked to you a little bit about semantic memory, what might be going wrong in semantic memory and how we might look at it. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the symptoms that might be related to this problem. So the symptoms that are linked to semantic memory are delusions and thought disorder. So I'll start by talking to you about delusions. Now for those of you who aren't clear on exactly what delusions are, they're a sort of false belief that's strongly held despite information to the contrary. Now some people get a little bit confused about the difference between hallucinations and delusions, so I'll just clarify. Hallucinations are when you hear, see, smell or feel something that just isn't there. Delusions are more about the beliefs that people hold. So an example of delusions might be persecutory delusions. So they're the idea that people are out to get you or they're plotting against you. And I can give you a couple of examples. So a few years ago I talked to a woman who thought that her neighbour was into human trafficking. And as a result, she was worried that he knew that she knew. So she actually left home and lived in a tent in a park for about a month because she was worried about what this person was going to do. When she got better, she realised that none of this was true, but she really felt persecuted and concerned at the time. Another woman thought that she'd been stolen from her family by her current bad family who were abusive to her and made her do all the housework and were very mean to her. So she felt like they were persecuting her and limiting her. And when she felt better, she thought that these were probably not true. Another kind of delusion that's common is the grandiose delusion. So that's the idea that you are special in some way. So that might be increased intelligence, might be mind-reading ability, might be that you're famous, it might be that you're a messenger from God or something like that. And these are quite common as well. A recent example I had of that was I had a man who told me that he received messages from the sky or from radio frequencies that told him about crimes that hadn't occurred yet. So he quite often rings the police station to tell them that this is going to happen. And so when he sees drug busts on television or he sees crimes that have been solved, he's quite sure that they're due to the information that he's passed on. So we do get some really quite strange ideas that people will hold really strongly, even if you can present quite a bit of information to the contrary. Now what's interesting, and we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, why do these happen? What's causing these and why can't we explain them to people? You know, there might be some cognitive deficits, but they're not so bad that people shouldn't be able to catch on to the fact that this isn't making sense. What we think it might be is something to do with that semantic memory system. What we find is there's certainly evidence that people with delusions will have more severe deficits in this system. And the idea is that perhaps it's because both delusions and that semantic system are really critical to meaning and knowledge and understanding the world. So we use our semantic memory to make inferences. So again, remember that wrench is a tool example. Now, if something was abnormal about your semantic system, or if you were using it in an unusual way, you might come up with some quite strange inferences about the world. And so that might be how you acquire these delusions initially. And then if you start to see the world from the point of view of that delusion, so you keep finding evidence to confirm it in your environment, you're strengthening that idea in the semantic system, which is therefore maintaining the delusion. So it's not as simple as just explaining it away anymore, because it becomes quite fixed in that memory system, which we know is sort of quite robust once it's set in place. Okay. So this is an interesting theory, and it does need to be worked on a bit, but there are quite a few research groups at the moment who are exploring it in a bit more detail. Now, the next symptom that's thought to be related to semantic problems is what we call thought disorder. So in the early days, this was described as an incoherence of thought. This incoherent thought was thought to lead to disorganised language, which in turn makes it difficult for people to communicate effectively. Now, I wasn't able to get permission to use a segment of thought-disordered speech from any of my participants, so I thought instead I'd get you to think about the Jabberwocky, the Lewis Carroll story. And I'll read you a segment, since I can't get it up on the slide there. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did jar and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the moonraths outgrabe." So that sounds like rubbish, in a way. It doesn't make sense, but at the same time it is beautiful and poetic. So this particular piece of writing comes up a lot in discussions of thought disorder because it uses the types of language that we do actually see in people who have this symptom. So in that particular piece, we have what we would call non-words or made-up words, but we also have what might be word approximations. So for example, it's been reported that the word mimsy might be a combination of the words flimsy and miserable, for example. So mixing up words and combining them in an unusual way. And I have seen this with participants. So I had a participant who described the jumper I was wearing as a frumper. And when I asked him to explain what exactly he meant by that, he said he thought it was bulky, unattractive and not feminine. So he wasn't a fan. But essentially it seemed as if he was trying to describe it as frumpy, but he ended up describing it as a frumper. So we do see that occasionally. Now, the more common forms of thought disorder that you'll see, you might speak to someone with thought disorder about a topic. And what they'll often do is they'll drift further and further and further away from the topic as you go along until you're talking about something completely different and you can't quite remember where you started. Another thing they might do is if you ask them a direct question, they might talk around the question without ever actually answering it. Or alternatively, and this is a bit of a more severe example, you might start by talking about a topic and they might just suddenly jump onto something completely unrelated that you don't know how they got there. And it's thought that these slips in language might occur because the semantic system is not inhibiting that unrelated information. So remember those indirect words that they do have, they respond to that because it seems though the appropriate inhibition is missing. So the theory goes that delusions might be resulting from faulty inference and the thought disorder might be resulting from a lack of inhibition in the system. All right, so we've talked about semantic memory, we've talked about how it might be related to symptoms. I'm just going to finish up by telling you about a study that I did for my PhD. So what we did was we gave ketamine to a group of people with no psychosis to see if we could cause those sort of semantic deficits for a short while and to see whether we got delusions and thought disorder as well and whether they were all related in the way that we find them to be in schizophrenia. Now, the question you might ask is, well, why are you giving people without schizophrenia drugs to look at these problems? Surely you should just be looking at people with schizophrenia. There are a number of reasons why researchers use drug models. One important reason is that once someone is diagnosed with schizophrenia, they're generally put on an antipsychotic medication which can affect memory. Further, substance abuse is a common comorbid problem in this group, probably an attempt at self-medicating, and educational pursuits are often interfered with by symptoms, especially given that schizophrenia onset is usually somewhere in that mid-teen area. So it's quite difficult with a schizophrenia group to tease out what factors are associated with schizophrenia itself and what factors are secondary to that diagnosis. So by using a drug that mimics schizophrenia, you can examine symptoms in a group of people who aren't affected by those secondary deficits. So what we did is we gave people with no history of schizophrenia that ketamine, and then we looked at their semantic memory on a few of those tasks I showed you, and thought disorder and delusions. We were also really interested to see if we could get that indirect priming effect in the group, because as I mentioned, that's quite a robust finding in schizophrenia and quite an unusual one as well. Now, the next question you might ask is, well, what's ketamine and why are you giving them that? Ketamine is an anaesthetic. It's more commonly known as being a horse tranquilizer, and it's also used as a drug of abuse where it's often referred to as Special K. What makes it useful for us is that it induces brief psychotic symptoms. Now, in the early days, people would use amphetamines to model schizophrenia because it also induces psychosis. What's especially interesting about ketamine is it not only induces psychosis, it's also been found to induce some of those memory problems that we've been talking about, and they're the ones that we were most interested in. So ketamine was our drug of choice. So as I mentioned, we looked at those different areas of memory, delusions and thought disorder in 22 people in what we call a double-blind placebo-controlled study. Now what that means is on one occasion, participants received ketamine, and on another occasion, they received a placebo, so it was just saline or something like that. Now, they didn't know on which occasion they would receive ketamine, and neither did I as the person testing them. Only the anaesthetist knew. So we were trying to control for the sort of expectation effects that people might have. And what we did find is when people were affected by ketamine, they did have semantic problems, they did have some thought disorder, and they did have delusions. Especially when compared to that placebo condition. Now, a couple of the examples of the delusions we got, one person thought that he was being very negatively and harshly judged by me and the other experimenter during the task, and he felt very worried about what we were saying and what we were thinking about him. And another girl thought the computer that we had her doing some of the tasks on was deliberately putting up the wrong answers to get her in trouble and make her look stupid. So they both felt quite persecuted. And once the ketamine had worn off, they reported these feelings and reported thinking they seemed just bizarre in retrospect. Now, although we did get some lovely delusions, we only got them in a very small number of people. And although we did get significant thought disorder, the levels were still really very low. This might have been because we needed a higher dose of ketamine. It might have been because we needed to get them to talk more to collect more thought disorder information. Unfortunately, you don't want to leave someone on ketamine for too long or they'll probably just fall asleep as it is an anaesthetic. So we didn't have a lot of time to play around and add in extra things. As a result of these low levels, we weren't able to get that relationship between semantic function and those symptoms, but we certainly did get semantic abnormalities. And the most interesting finding of this study was we got that indirect priming effect. So when these people were on placebo, they didn't have any priming. Indirect pairs didn't help them at all. When the same people were given ketamine, they did have indirect priming, suggesting that that finding really is related to schizophrenia and probably not just a result of antipsychotic medication or years of illness or anything else that might confound it. So this data's been written up and accepted by the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology, where it'll be put out in a lot more detail. And I'm continuing to look at the relationship between delusions, thought disorder and semantic memory in the current studies that I'm doing now, but they're not quite ready to be spoken about just yet.